welcome to my show, Searching for Integrity. My name really is John Smith, and I'm searching for people with integrity. Why? Because our country suffers from IDD, integrity deficit disorder. We have as our guest today John Suzuki and his book, American Grit, from a Japanese American concentration camp rises by an American war hero. That's quite an introduction.
Thank you, John. Nice to be here.
Well, I'm interested in this, other than but talking to you anyway. Uh, and I thought that I would ask you some. Did I ask you whether or not you had a table of contents?
Yes, and I did send it to you.
Oh, wow, okay. I missed it. Let's see. That's all right.
That's okay.
Now, I'm looking at how many years were the what were they called? Concentration camps?
Well, it's interesting because the world is full of euphemisms. And in the United States during World War II, they called them internment camps and relocation camps. But by every definition, they were also concentration camps, but nobody wanted to call them concentration camps because they kind of reserved that term for the Holocaust in Europe. But of course, calling it as I see it, those were more extermination camps than concentration
Right.
camps.
No,
And so
you're right
I'm
about
kind of
that.
lifting everything to what I think is more accurate. And so in the United States, these were in fact concentration camps because it was a concentration of a race of people. And that's the only reason why they were there was because of their race. In a small, relatively small area with inadequate facilities. And that's pretty much the definition of a concentration camp. So,
Right.
yeah.
Now, in terms of the parents and children, so forth,
Yes.
um, I'm going to say not very many parents are still around.
Oh, none. I'll
Okay.
tell you none. Even the kids are um, uh, leaving us, are largely gone. But yeah, it affected everybody who was of 1/16th Japanese ancestry in 1942 was evacuated and placed in concentration camps, 10 concentration camps scattered across the United States in the worst places in the deserts and swamps in America where nobody wanted to live. And they were one of the prevailing attitudes at that time, after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, was that if they looked like the enemy, they were the enemy,
Right.
including babies and American children.
Really.
And you speak of integrity. This was one of the worst breaches of integrity in, in our country's history. It really was.
Well, somewhere, somehow, somebody got a way of the rules, and these are going to be the rules. Was there
Yeah.
a particular part of the other U.S. government that we know?
Well, one of the things that really scares me is that I think Franklin Delano Roosevelt, at least what I understand, was a pretty good president, and he made just a really bad decision in signing Executive Order 9066, which authorized the military to create these exclusion zones on the West Coast. Now, the thing is that there was genuine fear. There was genuine fear of the Japanese attacking the West Coast,
Yes.
and there were a number of different forces behind this. One of them was economic. There was a whole bunch of people that were envious of the success of
Uh-huh.
folks of Japanese ancestry with their farms here in the United States, their businesses, and so forth. So you had that underlying current, but the big one was you had World War II happen, and so even Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife,
Sure.
was against it, was against his decision. But all the forces kind of combined to make that really dark part of our history happen.
Right, right. Now, what year was this when you started marching people into the camps?
1942. So it was,
1942.
yeah, it was an executive order that was signed on February 19th of 1942, which was basically 3 months after or 2 months after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and it was sweeping. It was and folks who were caught up in it, everybody of Japanese ancestry, American citizens and non-citizens alike, were caught up in this dragnet, and they lost everything. They lost their
Right.
homes, they lost their farms, they lost their businesses, because all they could take with them was what they could carry. And you can't carry a farm. and
No.
so and so they had no choice but to get rid of everything, because they had no idea how long they were going to be gone, what
Uh-huh.
was going to happen to them, if they were ever going to come back. Nobody knew anything, and so it was a very terrifying time for the folks back then. The only reference point they had was what was happening with the Jews in Europe, in Nazi
Yes.
Germany. Yeah,
Right. Um, when did this end?
it ended in 1945 after the war ended, and
Okay.
after the war ended, they closed the camps, and 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 they gave and I'm being a little bit sarcastic, but not much. But they gave everybody a pat on the back, $25 and a one-way bus ticket anywhere,
Really?
wherever
Mm,
they
mm.
felt like going. And it was thank you very much. But we found nothing. We found not a single person who was convicted of spying, of
Right.
Japanese ancestry. But you know what? We'll call it good and have a nice life. I mean, it's just terrible, just terrible. Yeah.
Right. Were there a lot of complaints about the food?
Well, in a lot of cases, the food was not for human consumption because it
Mm.
was spoiled, and the big thing was that uh, it was army food, right?
Right.
It was army
Right.
food. These people were stuck in camps surrounded by barbed wire, with armed guards, with armed soldiers. And uh, a lot of times, my understanding is that they were fed army food that the army didn't even want. And so one of the first orders of priority was food.
Mhm.
And when they were inside these camps, and again, these camps are out in the desert, 100-degree plus in the summertime, 0 degrees in the wintertime. The buildings were made out of pine lumber and tar paper, and that's it. And
Wow.
they had to come together to make their own food. So the cooks who were cooks, before they were interned, became the cooks for the camps, and
Right.
the doctors
Yeah.
became the doctors in the hospitals that they built, and the school teachers became school teachers in the camps, in the schools that they built. And yeah, it was a crazy time. So top priority was food. One interesting tidbit was that there was one concentration camp that I write about called Minidoka, and it was in
Right.
the deserts of Idaho at the time. And
Uh-huh.
if you go there now, which I did, if you go to where Minidoka used to be, you'll see that it's completely green and fertile farmland. Back in 1942, it was desert. It was sagebrush and tumbleweeds.
Oh.
And the Japanese inmates there, they brought irrigation to the deserts of Idaho, and now it's all green. It's farmland. So yeah, that part of it was all about growing their own food that they were accustomed to.
Well, I've had some of those rations when I was in Nam, and we were told they were improved, but no thanks.
Sure. Compared to what?
Well, I was lucky. I was never in the field. Yeah.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so I wasn't a grunt. I got lucky about that part.
Yeah.
Um, when the people and children, did they have educational schools there?
Yeah, well, they built them.
Yeah,
They built them within the camps, and so they built stores, they built hospitals, they had their own police detail and fire department and schools. And so they came together as a community
right.
and built everything that they needed. And so they figured it out. They took a really bad worst situation of their lives and came together, and instead of rolling up in a ball
Yeah,
and cowering under the sofa, they came
right.
together and said, okay, how are we going to make the best of this, and what can we do? And they did, and they created everything they needed to.
Did they have schools there beyond children? Say older teenagers or even
Well, yeah,
adults?
they had schools all the way from K through 12. I don't know if they had formal schools for adults. I don't know, but the uh, schools for the kids they created and
Right.
managed themselves. And
What was
this concentration camp in Idaho with 13,000 people became one of the largest towns in Idaho. You know,
right?
and um, and so yeah, they all came together.
That's good. Well, they didn't have any other choice.
Yeah.
That's the way I would see it. Now, did what about health? Were medics hanging around? Was there a hospital there?
Yeah, they built hospitals. 1,000 babies were born in the
Really?
camp, and yeah, and
That's
um,
great.
and so, yeah, and because a lot of the people, a lot of the Japanese Americans were doctors and nurses, on the outside in their real life, and
Right,
so yeah, they managed as best they could. It was terrible. I mean, there's also mental health problems. A bunch of people committed suicide, and to this day, there are folks who are suffering from PTSD from that whole experience.
right,
But yeah, they managed the best they could.
right. Well, that's encouraging. Um, I think as a people, Japanese people, they've got a lot of what's a good word for it? They got a lot of good stuff. I mean, they're brave people,
Hmm.
and how they took it on, what they were given, and they as best they could dealt with it.
Yeah, and part of it was their culture. There's a saying in Japanese called that shikata ga nai. Roughly translated, that means, suck it up. Life's not fair. There's nothing you can do about it, so get on with it. And that was a real common sentiment within the Japanese community. Uh, fall down 7 times, get up 8. That came
Yeah,
from it came from the Japanese. And the last thing I'll share is you will always hear Japanese folks saying gaman, which means suck it up and don't complain. Do not complain. There's nothing you can do about it, and don't bring shame to your
right,
family. So
right.
all of those kinds of things kind of resonated across the community because they all shared those values.
Yeah. What was there a church there? Were there any religions?
Yeah, I will say I'll say this as an irony in that a big part of my story was about over 1,000 men who volunteered out of that one Minidoka concentration camp in Idaho to fight and in many cases die for the United States Army, who put them and their families in those camps to begin with, right? And then
Right,
they went off to fight for the United States Army while their families remained imprisoned by the United States Army. And the irony that I want to speak about is that, when a family loses a soldier, a detail of American officers comes to that soldier's home and presents an American flag to their parents. Well, imagine, if you will, a detail of American soldiers and officers coming to the barracks of the parents in a concentration camp to present them with a gold star and an American flag in an American prison.
huh,
It just breaks your heart. And
yeah,
and so So back to your comment or your question about churches. Yeah, there were a lot of Buddhists, a lot of Christians, and so as with everything else, they made do. And and the ultimate irony of the whole thing was that here these guys were fighting for freedom and democracy around the world, and yet their families were stuck in a concentration camp with their constitutional rights taken away in America. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. And my whole mission when I learned about, all of these different stories, I knew a lot about it, but I didn't know all of it, was to make folks aware that this happened, and make sure that the experiences of all those folks never get forgotten. So we never do it again,
So from 42 to 45, that's 3 years
Mm-hmm.
then.
Yeah, 3.5 years.
3 long years, half years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, after when it was closed, were there any assistance with
Yeah, well,
with jobs and things like that?
really interesting that you asked that question. The only assistance really that was notable was $25 in a one-way bus ticket. And the sad part about it was that they had spent 3.5 years building these communities after having been evicted from their homes. And they built these communities in these camps as their homes. And now they're being evicted all over again with the $25 pat on the back. The really sad part that I learned was that during the war they were feared, and they were viewed as the enemy, right? After the war, when they went home, it in a lot of ways it was worse because they were not only viewed as the enemy, but they were viewed as the enemy that lost.
Mhm.
A lot of the guys up in Seattle, they came home and wanted to join the veterans of foreign wars, and they were rejected because of their Japanese ancestry. I mean, these guys
Right.
became among the most decorated war heroes in American history, and the veterans of foreign wars, the VFW, refused them. So when they came back, it was tough. It was tough for them to find jobs. It was tough for them to find homes and housing. It was just tough all around. And a quick story. I
Right.
write about a gentleman named Daniel Inouye. Daniel Inouye died in 2019, I think it was. But anyway, he was a United States senator for almost 50 years, and he lost his right arm in World War II. When he came back to the United States, he walked into a barber shop with his right arm missing and wearing his American uniform. And the barber said, "Young man, you need to take a look at that sign." And the sign says, "We don't cut Jap hair." This guy went on to become a Medal of Honor recipient, and he lost his right arm wearing his American uniform. And that's how he was treated, right? And so it took a long, long time, decades, for that for a lot of that sentiment to subside and go away. So yeah, it was tough. It was tough in a lot of cases.
Well, that's a sorry situation, and
Hmm.
obviously they didn't have any guidance with respect to it ought to be done and ought to be done sooner. Um, so I hear, guess here, I don't know, it's what is it, 75 years now that your book is late?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Better late than never, I guess, right? Yeah, but that's the thing. I retired a little over a year ago from my career, my working career,
Uh,
in technology. And I traveled a lot. And, as I traveled the country and traveled the world, it was amazing to me how many people didn't know about these camps and about what happened
right,
in this
right.
really dark chapter of our history. And so that was kind of the impetus for me,
Mhm.
of making people aware, reminding people that this happened, especially in this world today where, history is being canceled, people are being canceled, and this story just isn't being taught as widely as I think it should be. And in a lot of cases, it's just being kind of swept under the rug. So, my hope is to raise that awareness and raise that education, because history forgotten often has a way of repeating itself. And this is one chapter that can't happen again in this country.
Well, yeah, it needs to be done, and you're doing it.
Yeah, I'm
It's
trying to.
it, yeah, you're doing a good job with that. Um, was there anything, in a sense, left out that you can think of that they?
In terms of this conversation,
Yes.
um, well, I mean, there's story after story after story. I will say this, when
Hmm.
people will often ask me, John, do you really think this can happen in America again? And I'll refer to two situations. The first one, which happened about 20 years ago or so,
Right.
was 9/11.
Yeah.
9/11. When we were attacked, somebody came up with the misguided idea that all Muslims must be terrorists and therefore should be rounded up and put away. Um, I am proud to say that a large part of the Japanese community rose up and said, no, 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 no. Been there,
Right.
done that, folks. That ain't going to happen again.
Yeah.
And a story that I learned that not many people know about was that President Bush at the time had a transportation secretary named Norman Mineta. And Norman Mineta had spent part of his childhood in an American concentration camp during World War II.
Hmm.
And so when President Bush's advisors came to him and said, hey, look, this is what we need to do, President Bush said, whatever you come to me with, do not come to me with a solution that that guy has already experienced. In other words, do not tell me that we need to round people up. And it
Sure.
didn't happen. But more recently, what's really scary was COVID, right? There was talk about rounding up everybody who had COVID and putting them and isolating them. And it's fear. It's fear and isolation of people and what I call bucketizing of people
Hmm. Yep.
that got us into this mess to begin with. And it's happening. It's all happening right now. And the one thing that you and I can promise everybody in your audience is
Hmm.
that something really, really bad is going to happen again.
Hmm.
Bad stuff happens. It's unavoidable. And the question is going to be, how are we going to respond, to the bad things that happen and not not place blame. Blame and fear are two really, really big problems in
Right.
this country right
Right.
now,
You're right.
which are probably two big reasons why integrity is so hard to find these days.
It is, and I can't imagine why it's there. And it's all
Hmm.
those people that do you have any integrity? They'll start uh, going through their pockets and like, and they don't know what it is.
Yeah, yeah.
Sad, sad, sad,
Well,
sad.
I love that. I love that you're bringing this to the forefront and challenging people, you know,
Hmm.
and because it really, really is important. And in our world these days of fear, and I'll call it fear and blame.
Hmm.
If there's a way that we could just take some of that energy of fear and shift it a little bit away from fear and towards a little bit more love, and if we could take some of that energy of blame and shift it to a
Hmm.
little bit more personal responsibility, I think if we could do that, we can move mountains, and that may start shifting people over to the other end of the spectrum, of integrity. And my definition of integrity, by the way, I've heard lots of definitions. One of which is integrity is what you do when nobody's looking. And I personally believe that integrity is the good stuff you do, especially when nobody's looking, and the
Right,
right things to do. You always do the right
right.
thing. Set aside the
Yeah,
good thing. Sometimes the
yeah.
right thing to do isn't always uh, good, but always doing the right thing, especially when nobody's looking. And the example that I use is, you give somebody $10 for $5 worth of groceries, and they give you change for a $20 bill. Um, do you just kind of look at them and stick that money in your pocket, or do you say, "Hey, look, you gave me a little bit too much change"?
Right.
Just little stuff like that.
It
It's the
is
little
little.
things that make up the person who you are, in my view.
Let's talk about your book, where it's sitting for sale.
Yeah, so I'm finding it in more and more places, which is really cool. It's only been out for for just under 3 months, but it's an Amazon bestseller,
Yes.
and I'm finding it in interestingly, I'm finding it in places like museums. The Japanese American National Museum picked up my book American Grit, and which is amazing for me.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, yeah. And folks are telling me that they're starting to see it in stores. But if your audience is interested in it, it's called American Grit. Easiest place is to get it from Amazon.
Probably.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and that's it right there. It's got an American flag on it. And one of my friends told me, they said, John, you named it American Grit. I said, yeah. They said, when people think of the words American Grit, they don't think of a bunch of Japanese people in concentration camps.
Right. No. No, they don't.
So, yeah,
Well,
yeah, but
they don't know about it.
yeah, exactly,
That's
exactly.
your job.
Yep, yep, yep. That's what I picked up.
Well, I want to thank you for being our guest today, and
My
I want to
pleasure.
thank my listeners, um, and tuning into searching for integrity is always a good thing. And I also have my adios, and it goes so long and happy trails to all.
Indeed.
Indeed, until we see you again.